We're moving on to session 2 with the wonderful Ray Poynter, President of NewMR. Congratulations, by the way, on running for England. It's amazing. Welcome, Ray.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's a delight to be here, and I was invited to come along and said, we really need somebody to leverage your age. What is the history of all the stuff that's gone wrong over the years? So this is going to be a whistle-stop tour through various examples of shockers, but there have been many more over the years. This is just a few. So what can we learn from them? First of all, the Ford Edsel. This is a classic marketing error from the United States back in the 50s. They designed this car. They did masses of research. It's got the best bonnet or hood, depending on which side of the ditch you come from. It's got a great grille. It had a great choice of wheels. It came in 18 versions, and it absolutely bombed because they didn't research the entirety. They didn't research what is the best car. They researched the best grille, the best wheels, and best options. So the data quality issue there was not asking the right question. This is another one. I actually worked on this project along with hundreds of other people. And we answered the questions we were asked quite properly. For those of you who were not around, they were being attacked by the Pepsi sip test ads. So you get a whole bunch of Coke drinkers in, you give them a blind taste test. It's just a sip, and quite a lot of them preferred the Pepsi to the Coke, and this rattled the people at Coke. And so they reformulated Coke over and over again, and they came up with a formula that tasted better than original Coke. And that's what all the testing, and it was done in lots of countries, and so they launched it. And there was an enormous problem in the US. Don't sit on the phone. There was an enormous problem in the US because nobody had researched, can we remove your heritage and take away Coke and replace it with this better tasting Coke? And that, again, was the problem. So it's not a data quality error on either of those. It was a questions error. And I like the way that Deborah and Melanie were highlighting it's not just fraud. It's not just question. It can quite often be that we've done the wrong research. So here's a one that we should all remember. Beecham, Suze, Yankelovich, Clancy, Schumann, because the silly people at Yankelovich gave a very firm prediction that this was what the market share was going to be. And it wasn't. We don't know all the reasons why it wasn't. It could have been sampling error. It could have been problems with the sample. It was probably quite a lot to do with the data and analytics and so on. But they got sued for a fortune. So since then, we've all been a bit more careful about not over-claiming. And actually, coming back to the last presentation, when one data company says we're great and they're rubbish, that actually damages everybody, not just the people that they're trying to criticize. Polling errors. This is a frequent one that crops up. I was actually on the radio this night. So as a Liberal talking about how well we were going to do, we didn't. And as a representative of our industry saying how well we were going to do, and we didn't. So these are a couple of British examples, but like the humdinger has got to be 1936. I'm sure many of you can remember this. 1936, Alf Landon was going to beat Roosevelt. The Literary Digest had a sample of over 2 million people. And they printed the front page of the magazine, the Literary Digest, saying that Alf Landon was going to win. He won 2 of the 48 states, because there were only 48 states then, and lost all the others by a enormous 24% behind. Why did that happen? It was sampling frame error. Really boring sounding thing, sampling frame error. They sent out the surveys to the 10 million people who had bought a car that year, 1936 recession, had a telephone, 1936 recession, or a subscription to the Literary Digest. And they voted for the middle class candidate in that opinion poll. Segway. This is quite a lovely, a couple of my second cousins there up in the forest, in Sherwood Forest, on a Segway. There was a lot of research into how it might be used and how we done, and they forecast that it was going to be enormous. 1 million sales in 2 years. In 6 years, they sold 30,000. Why? Well, it was the price of a small car, $5,000 back then. If you ride it to work, where are you going to store it? It weighs 45 kilograms, 7 stones. Melanie, 100 pounds. We've got all the units here. It was simply physically too heavy. So when they're doing the research, they didn't then follow that through and say, okay, now pick it up to go up the stairs. Now put it in a cupboard. Where exactly at home are you going to put this? NPS. There's a lot of evidence it doesn't work. So should we, from a data quality point of view, be selling it and making quite such bold claims about it? Even if it does work, it attracts gaming. So I stopped at a Holiday Inn in Milton Keynes when I was qualifying for the England team to run the marathon later this year. What would I do? 3:37, which is not bad at that. But going out of the Holiday Inn, this is how you're supposed to fill in the NPS question. I actually worked with one company that got rid of all of the customers who gave low scores. That's a really effective way of improving your scores. Panel quality issues. So 1 or 2 people remember when Kim Dedeker was on client side. We've had this over and over again, coming around in cycles. As Melanie was talking about earlier, we've seen over and over this. We really do have to grasp it this time round, because you've got that dirty little secret of online panels, the sequel of the sequel of the sequel coming through. TV ratings. There have been enormous scandals over the years. So it's not just survey data, because this by and large is metered data. But who do you give the meters to? There was a wonderful ad a few years ago. There were a couple on a sofa, very passionate. There was a TV with a TV monitor on it, and the comment underneath it, who's getting screwed here? The ratings company, of course, and all the people buying the publishing data. Lots of issues in the US, lots of issues in India as well, usually settled out of court, so we don't know all the details. Patients like me, it's not just survey data. This was the front page of the Wall Street Journal. They spotted some activity. Patients Like Me was a community for self-help groups, and they spotted that they were being scraped. So they looked at the account that was scraping them, and it was from Nielsen Buzzmetrics. And this then got global coverage, and it also led to the winding up of the Buzzmetrics name and the operation, because clearly that is an unethical way of collecting data. Cambridge Analytica, yeah, that was an interesting combination of surveys, friends, harvesting. This, I mean, you harvest organs, don't you? I mean, these were harvesting people. Find an enormous amount of money, a lot of damage actually to our industry and the whole process of collecting information, as well as to Facebook, as well as to governments. Juicero, this is quite an interesting one. Lots and lots of design thinking research. Now, I'm not anti-design thinking, but it has to be in a context. They got the product better and better for a handful of people who wanted it, but there were not enough of those people to make the product successful. There wasn't any market analysis in that research. And sometimes when you see the design thinkers go overboard, it is too much around testing this with 6 people. They will often read that they think 5 or 6 is the optimum number of people to test a product with. True in some contexts when you're looking for improvements, but you still need to look at the market context. This is really, really recent. This is just a few weeks ago in the Netherlands, big data breach impacting several clients beyond that. Again, this is going to be really worrying. There are going to be more and more attacks on data systems. We're going to see this is coming with the AI thing. We're going to see this coming through partly as a consequence of some of the Russian activities where the state is sponsoring disruptive characteristics. So there are some themes going on in all of that. undersampling some groups. So that TV ratings I talked about, one of the big issues is not sampling the particular disadvantaged groups and so on. Not sampling the right people when you're doing surveys for polling. Not asking the right question. This is a really big issue. Doing the wrong analysis. So when you're doing market forecasts, the wrong analysis will often cause a problem. Using data without permission. Security and processes, and it's on the list, but it's actually not the biggest problem historically in terms of fraud and corruption. I'm just going to throw one in which Adam Phillips highlighted to me. There was in the UK a whole fuss about student interviewers going home to the universities and filling in the forms in the dorm rooms, and that led to the MRS's interviewer quality scheme. So it's always been a process. Quality has never just happened. There is also this wonderful framework. It's called the Total Survey Error Framework. And all researchers, when they think about designs and processes, should be aware of it. So let's consider sales forecasting. Does asking intention to buy work as a question? That's this up here, the construct validity. Does your scale measure intention? That's the measurement process. Maybe that 5-point scale doesn't work. Does the processing turn into prediction? So do we have benchmarking? Are we taking into account sales? Are we taking into account advertising, distribution? Have we surveyed the right people? So now we're getting into one of the quality issues. What is the sampling error? That's like a tiny part of the whole process. And do we have non-response issues? So all of these will guide us towards having a better quality outcome. And have we weighted the data properly? Frankly, with most commercial clients, it's have you weighted it at all? But we'll ignore that for the moment. Thank you very much, and I would love to hear any questions.
Thank you, Ray. I feel like I've been schooled slightly on the history of all the bad stuff. Fascinating. I knew about half of those, but there's some really interesting ones there. I'd love some questions from those watching online. There is a slight delay, so please put the questions in as you hear our speakers. And if you have any for Ray, please put them in now, and we're paying attention. I have a question to start, and then I'd like to ask the audience. A lot of things you pointed to there are research fundamentals, things that, in my experience as a client agency side, I've not always been taught some of these fundamentals. Do you think that it's a basic skills issue in the industry, in research design? Is that what we're seeing coming through here as a trend?
We are. I mean, one of the different hats that I wear is I do quite a lot of training for different organisations, particularly with the MRS, and I've noticed that we're getting more and more client-side people coming to the training, because as we get more self-serve platforms, as we get more of these tools, people are recognizing that you need to know the basics. What is a bias question? What is a leading question? Why should I care that the standard deviation of this piece of data is massively different to the standard deviation here? So I explained to them that we statisticians call it a measure of spready outness. The more spready out it is, the more unreliable it is, full stop. So yes, we really need to keep pushing the fundamentals.
Thanks. Questions from the audience? Mel.
Ray, that was a really interesting presentation, and I was involved in the polling inquiry from 2015, so I remember that in my nightmares. But my question actually is, if you were here in 10 years' time, what do you think will be the new issues that are on your list that we'd be facing?
I think they'll be AI related. I think that I think there'll be AI and neurobiometrics related, because I think we're going to see a whole raft of techniques that don't work come into play. I'm not saying that all neuro and biometrics doesn't work. Not with my SMR hat on, I'm not saying that. But some don't, quite clearly. And we are beginning to see virtual responses coming back from AI. So I don't need to show you the packaging to real people. I can show it to a computer that would guess what people will have said. And I think we're going to see more virtual responses coming out of AI. We have got 10 million virtual people in our AI database. We can survey the whole 10 million in 15 minutes. Why do you bother going to real people? And I think the consequences of that over the next 10 years and unintended harm, where things that were supposed to be anonymous, if we think back to Target says you're pregnant is the front page of the Newsweek, where they were able to identify that this man's daughter was pregnant because of the change in purchasing patterns. Unintended removal of anonymity. So there is intended, which is bad, but actually unintended could be really bad too.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience or from online? I have one. You touched on it lightly, synthetic data, which is a term I'm hearing more and more, synthetic panelists, synthetic respondents. It's a bit of a grey area, isn't it? So we're training models using survey respondents, which means that the ethics and all the methodological considerations we'd have in survey design become even more important when training a model to predict how respondents would perform. What are your thoughts on that? Is it you've touched on it already? Do you think that's a big area for?
I think it's going to be an enormous area because it's going to be incredibly fast and it's going to be incredibly cheap. So those are the two biggest things that clients care about. So then we've got to look at the better and the good enough, because frankly, if it's good enough and it's better and cheap, that is also going to work. So it's going to come down to those issues. We've been doing some of this for years. So some of you will know all about hierarchical Bayesian choice modeling, but effectively that's creating synthetic respondents. You're creating alternative universes. You're then taking aggregations of those alternative universes and saying, we think that the part worths should be distributed like this. So that is there, and there's quite a lot of stats behind it about how reliable that is. Synthetic respondents doesn't have that background to it yet. And what we're seeing with ChatGPT is it's much more plausible. The really scary thing about hallucinations from ChatGPT is they're believable. I mean, normally when people serve you rubbish, it looks like rubbish. This doesn't.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience.
Ray, I was just wondering if you can imagine a situation in the future where a client will be rejecting, on data quality grounds, synthetic responses from an AI.
Only if they were savvy.
Other questions for Ray? We have a few more moments. One at the back, one moment. There's two here. And again, if you're online, please do write the questions.
So at the moment, or for a while, I've been making an open source analytics package. When I was doing that, I was forced to make sure I mirrored weighting methodologies and SIG test methodologies, which are at least 40 years old, even though I know that they aren't necessarily the best. If that's the state we're in now, what do you see the future as?
Okay, so SIG testing is a really interesting case. In the commercial world of market research, we almost never use the stats we were taught at uni. We don't use chi-square tests, we don't use ANOVA very often at all. We use normal tests, we use t-tests, we don't do Bonferroni comparisons for multiple tests. It's a set of things going on. However, I remember being taught really early on that if you need to test the significance, it's probably too close to call anyway. So we need to be looking at bigger issues. I think that it requires some people to be looking at the stats. The rest of the world isn't. And I think that AI could well change it. I think it's perfectly possible, as we start to put in more AI, for it to run the right tests. So before it does the paired t-test, it will do a ANOVA to make sure that there is something going on in the data first, and then it will do a paired t-test. And it will also say you can't do a stats test on this because this is not a probabilistic sample. It doesn't have the right modality. It doesn't have the right variables. It's not behaving like a ratio scale. So I think we'll find at some point in the near future AI tools that would refuse to do the wrong analysis. And that would be a real plus, because not every, I'm a big AI fan, as well as all the downsides, and that is a real potential for good in that if we take your analysis package you talk about there, it would be able to offer up the right solutions. Okay, do you want the normal answers or do you want the right answers? And that would be a plus.
Thanks, Ray. A question here?
I'm afraid this is a bit of a mean question, Ray. You've talked about market research disasters. Have you got any examples of where market research has helped a client get out of a disastrous situation?
Oh, I mean, masses and masses and masses. And also, let's just start with where they simply work well. Most good products. I'm glad that we're not recording this or it's online, because I used to work for one of the major ad testing companies for a year, based somewhere in the Warwick area. And the Guinness Wave ad was tested and succeeded, and what they absolutely knew it was going to work. The company saying they didn't test it and it was all intuition was purely marketing. It was fully tested. And lots of other things like that have been tested as we've gone through the process. A lot of good disaster management is around listening to what's going on. So when BP spilled all that oil in the Gulf of Mexico, they were listening through the social media, listening processes, and they kept talking about how they were going to fix it until the volume of the conversation started to decline. And then they shut up. Because one of the rules about disaster management is when it's fading, you don't say anything. You keep trying to do something like they sacked the boss and a few other things on the upswing. But as soon as that turns, and so such a lot of monitoring processes like that, we learn more from the errors, but the successes are far more frequent.
Thank you, Ray. We actually have a question from the live stream.
Hi, Ray. So the questions come from Finn in Amsterdam. So the
That's a nice hello.
Who the Morga?
so the question is, poster audience measurement has been downgraded from eyes on to walking past as it generates a bigger number. Will the tension between commercial motivation and good research understanding increase?
I mean, this is a to and fro. We saw that with online advertising, which for a while was recording as being seen things that didn't appear on the visible part of the screen. And as the technologies are improving, because there are now eye tracking devices you can put on billboards that will say how many eyes turn to the billboard. And in those sort of cases, you will see more genuine stuff, because the people who own the billboards obviously want to be able to sell the people who walk past. The people who are buying the advertising, it comes back to that phrase, I know that half my advertising is wasted, but I don't know which half. Most of the good improvements have come from the savvy advertisers, the clients wanting to be able to pay the right amount of money for the stuff they're getting. And so much other stuff is targetable that it will keep pushing back in the right direction.
Ray, thank you very much for all those fantastic answers, and thank you for the questions, everyone.
Oh, I should ask, in my humble opinion,